Hello everyone. Today we are going to be discussing chemistry and the chemical composition of our bodies. We'll talk about the organization of matter, we'll talk about chemical reactions, and then we'll talk about the role of all of that when it comes to human physiology. When we talk about the organization of matter, we have the smallest unit, which is called the atom. And as we'll see here in a moment, atoms are made up of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which all come together to make that atom. And per human cell, there are 100 trillion, or roughly 100 trillion atoms per cell, which is crazy to think about because it's hard enough to think about human cells because it's such a small scale compared to us and everything that is going on at the cellular level. And all the molecules that make up the cell are comprised of these atoms, and so there are many forces at play at these atomic levels, reactions that are occurring between these atoms that allow us to have life and to have an existence of the universe here. And then those atoms will come together to make something called an element. And an element is matter composed of one type of atom. So whether that be hydrogen or oxygen or carbon, atoms that are similar are going to come together to make these elements. And so, like I said earlier, there are three main subatomic particles: a proton, which is a positively charged particle; a neutron, which has no charge. Both of these are the nucleus of the atom, so both of these will come together at the center of the atom. And then you have electrons. And here in the figure we see the cloud model versus the shell model. Depends on when you went to school and when you learned these things. But traditionally, the subatomic particles, or mainly the electron, were taught in this shell model, where the shells that surrounded the nucleus held a certain amount of electrons. But these electrons are thought to basically orbit in these shells. And nowadays we look more towards the cloud model because electrons are very active. They're going to be jumping around and bouncing around. And so if you took a snapshot of it, yes, it would probably look, something like the shell model here. But in reality, since they're moving around so quick and could be bouncing from shell to shell, position to position, we just tend to think of it more as this cloud where this electron, at any given moment, could be anywhere, but they are moving really fast and very rapidly. When we look at different elements, we can see that they vary in the amount of protons and the amount of neutrons and the amount of electrons. So when we characterize these elements, we can characterize it by the atomic number, which is going to be the amount of protons within that atom, the mass number, which is going to be both the number of protons and neutrons in that element or atom, and then the atomic mass, which is going to be the average mass of a stable atom for that element. So here we see, hydrogen, the smallest element here with an atomic number of 1 and a relatively small atomic mass. And then we get bigger and bigger, adding more protons, more neutrons. So a little bit bigger element, potassium, for example, is going to have way more protons and neutrons, and then also have a larger mass. And so all of these elements are grouped together, what's called the periodic table of elements. And it turns out that the characteristics of that element are largely based on these subatomic particles, right? So the size of the atom, the number of protons it has, the number of neutrons, the amount of electrons in its outer shells. And so you're going to see that these elements are going to react and behave, with one another based on those properties. We are going to have multiple atoms that come together and form bonds with other atoms in order to make more complex structures of matter. And so when you have two atoms that come together, you have what's called a molecule. And so here we see that the single atoms of oxygen are going to be sharing electrons to form a bond, and that makes an oxygen molecule. And this oxygen molecule can be found in the air, and we're going to breathe that air in and use that oxygen in order to carry out metabolic reactions in our body. When you have atoms of two or more different elements, that's going to be called a compound. So obviously it doesn't need to be the same elements, whether it be water or table salt. There are many different types of elements that can come together and react with other elements in order to form different structures. And then we have what's called a free radical. And this is when an atom or molecule has an unpaired electron in its outermost shell. This is going to give it a negative charge since it's a unpaired electron. And so you may have heard of free radicals when it comes to health and fitness, and that's why many promote antioxidants and things like that. But these free radicals are very reactive and can break apart other chemical bonds because of the energy here. And so, in our bodies, these free radicals can play many different roles and have many different effects. First, we'll be discussing ionic bonds. But before we go more into bonds, we first have to discuss the behaviors of elements. And so when we look at an atom, we could see that if we just look at the shells, that again, there are a certain amount of electrons that can fit into each cell. 2 on the first, 8 on the next 3, and then so on and so forth, right? But the outermost shell, called the valence shell, is going to have a certain amount of electrons. And when we look at the periodic table of elements, we could see that group 1 is going to have 1 valence electron, right? Just 1 on the outer shell, while the noble gases have completely full shells. And then, group 7 is going to have, just 1 missing from its outermost shell, and, so on and so forth. You could just count, 1 in its outermost, 2 in its outermost, 3 in its outermost, so forth and so on. So the thing is that atoms like to feel full in its outermost shell. And so the bonds that's going to form with other atoms are going to be based on the amount of available electrons. And so a lot of times what you'll see is that elements in the first group are willing to get rid of that electron in order to have a full valence shell. And so when they get rid of that electron, it's going to have a full shell, but now it's going to be positively charged because it lost that negatively charged particle. While in group 7, these elements are only 1 electron away from having a full shell. So they are going to be more likely to take on a negatively charged electron in order to be full, but then with that comes a negative charge. And so here we see a sodium ion, right? And that is developed because sodium, with 1 electron in its outermost shell, it's going to be willing to give up that electron. And when it does, it becomes positively charged. And so a lot of times when you look into the body, you're going to see most sodium ion or atoms are going to be ions, meaning that it is either positively charged or negatively charged. So these, when we say ion, that comes from, the fact that it's either lost or gained an electron. And so sodium is going to be found in its ion form, positively charged, missing that electron. While something like chlorine, it's missing, or it's 1 away from having a full outer shell. So it's likely going to pick up along the way an electron, completing its outermost shell. But with that electron, it's going to then get a negative charge, becoming a ion. So now this positively charged sodium ion and this negatively charged chlorine ion are going to come together because opposites attract. So this positive charge and this negative charge are going to attract these 2 atoms together. And when you get sodium and chlorine, bonded together through this ionic bond, you're going to get table salt. And so the salt that you see at any restaurant or in your home, this is because the positively charged sodium and the negatively charged chlorine are coming together in order to form an ionic bond. Next, we have covalent bonds. And so in an ionic bond, we had 2 ions that either lost or gained an electron that came together based on their charges. But in a covalent bond, what we're going to have is multiple atoms that are coming together and actually sharing electrons. So here up top, we see 3 examples of hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen coming together and sharing the electrons of a similar element to form a covalent bond. And so for hydrogen here, with one electron in this shell and one electron in its shell, they're going to want to feel full and complete, and so they're going to donate to each other and share these electrons between the two in order to form a single bond. It doesn't need to be just two electrons that are shared. It can be four, like in this example, and that's going to form a double bond, or for nitrogen here, coming together and forming a triple bond. And the more sharing that you have, the stronger the bond. So a triple bond is going to be stronger than a double, and then stronger than a single. And so it doesn't need to be atoms of the same element that form a covalent bond. Here we see an example of a carbon atom binding with 4 hydrogens in order to form methane. And so here, with carbon having 4 electrons in its valence shell and needing 4 more to have that complete outer shell, these hydrogens are going to come along, share their electrons, and this is going to form a bond. And right here we get the production of methane. And so now, talking about covalent bonds, we could classify them in 2 ways. Either what's called a polar covalent bond or a nonpolar covalent bond. And in a nonpolar covalent bond, which you saw in letters A through D, you're going to have an equal sharing of electrons. While in a polar covalent bond, you're going to see an unequal sharing of electrons. And this is based on something called electronegativity. And so going back to the periodic table, we are going to see that certain elements are going to be more attracted to electrons, are going to be a little bit more greedy when it comes to holding on to electrons. And so if we start at the bottom left-hand corner of the periodic table and work our way to the top right, this top right corner, especially oxygen and fluoride, are going to be more electronegative, meaning when they form these polar covalent bonds, they are going to hold on and have more affinity to those electrons. And while something like hydrogen, if it bonds to a more electronegative oxygen, it's going to donate basically those electrons. It's still going to be bound together. They still share those electrons, but oxygen is more greedy. It's saying, and this is very simplifying it, it's like, sure, you know, we're going to play together, but I'm going to hold on to the electrons more of the time. And because of this, you're going to develop poles, right? And that's why it's called a polar covalent bond. And so you're going to have partial positive and partial negative charges. And so the example, the most prevalent one, especially when it comes to life here on Earth, is water, right? So water is a polar covalent bond. So here we have an oxygen atom with two electrons away from feeling complete, and so 2 hydrogens can come along and basically share their electrons in order to complete this outermost shell. And so again, because oxygen is so much more electronegative than hydrogen, yes, they are going to still share all these electrons, but oxygen again is greedy. It's going to hold on to those electrons. And since those electrons are negatively charged, that's going to make oxygen partially negative charged. That's, you see this symbol here. And since hydrogens are basically not giving up, I'd hate to say giving up, but they are willing to let go of those electrons most of the time in order to form this bond, that is going to give those hydrogens a partial positive charge. And so again, once we start to see the formation of charges occur, that's going to give way for some reactions to occur. We'll talk about more of that in a little bit with hydrogen bonds. But because, again, of electronegativity and the strength of attraction of oxygen to take those electrons, we're going to form here what's called that polar covalent bond, where there's this unequal distribution, this unequal sharing of electrons. And that's different than a non-polar covalent bond, where there's more of an equal distribution. Speaking of hydrogen and water, we have what's called hydrogen bonds. And so we have different types of bonds. We have intramolecular forces, which hold together molecules, and then we have intermolecular forces, which are the forces that that hold together multiple molecules together. And so when we look at water, the example we just looked at, this oxygen, because it's so electronegative and so willing to take on those electrons, is going to form that partial negative charge. These hydrogens, willing to more so allow oxygen to hold on to those electrons, are forming a partial positive charge. These partial charges that are formed are going to allow this molecule to react with other nearby molecules. And so when they contain hydrogens, when these molecules contain hydrogens, these polar covalent bonds that are formed are then going to react with other molecules. And so this water molecule here, it's still going to have the partial negative charge on the oxygen and the partial positive charge on the hydrogen. And so now these partial charges, these partial positive and these partial negatives, are going to allow water molecules to basically bond together. And that's why when you look at water and the way it moves, it all moves together. If you took a cup like this and you turned it upside down, all that liquid is going to travel together. And those are because of the hydrogen bonds that are formed between these water molecules. Last, we have what's called a van der Waal interaction, which is an intermolecular force that allows two nonpolar molecules to actually have a weak bond to one another. And so in the example here, just the general example, we have a nonpolar molecule here and a nonpolar molecule here. But what's going to happen is, again, just because at a given moment the molecule is nonpolar doesn't mean that it can't have a sudden change in its charge on certain sides. And so here we're going to see molecule A induce a complementary transient unequal charge and distribution in nonpolar molecule B, meaning that there's going to be a movement of electrons within this molecule, a sudden change in the formation of that molecule, which gives this molecule a partial positive charge on one side and a partial negative charge on the other. So for whatever reason, more electrons have gone to this side and less have gone to this side, giving it partial positive or partial negative charge. Well, now the fact that this has a partial charge and it's sitting next to another molecule, well, opposites are going to attract. And so the partial negative charge on molecule A is going to attract the positive charges on this side, or even better, to explain it, it's going to repel electrons on this side of this molecule, right? And so this partial negative charge repels those electrons. They're going to go to the opposite side. And now the partial bonds that are formed is going to be called the van der Waal interaction. And so now this positively charged negative side and this partially charged positive side, they're going to attract these two molecules together in order to form a bond. Now, these forces are very weak. It's the weakest out of all the bonds that we have just discussed. However, again, these interactions can occur just due to the movement of electrons. What we are going to see in our bodies is that different elements are going to come together to form bonds and then be broken apart. And so these chemical reactions are going to occur all the time within our cells and within our bodies. And so we have what's called in chemistry the reactants, which are your starting substances, which then come together and form a product, which is your ending substance. So down below we see two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecule coming together to form H2O. And so constantly, not only are we going to have different elements coming together to form a bond, but energy is going to be also used to break apart bonds as well. So one of the most important inorganic compounds in our body is water, and water is going to be involved in many chemical reactions that take place in our cells. The reason why it's one of the most important compounds in our body is because it is the #1 solvent. Like I said in the first lecture, our body is made up of 55 to 65% water, and it is the universal solvent. It takes on many materials and many substances known as solutes in order to make mixtures. And so, most of the chemical reactions that are taking place within our bodies are taking place within water. And so another thing about water is that it has a very high specific heat. It can hold on to a lot of heat energy. One day-to-day example of this is when you're cooking. If you cook something on the stovetop, and if you were to touch the pan immediately after, you could see that, of course, that's going to be a very hot object, right? But you run cold water on it for just a few seconds, and water is going to take on most of that heat, most of that energy. It can hold on to heat very, very well. And so that just means it has a very high heat capacity. So many substances within our body are called hydrophilic or hydrophobic. And so hydrophilic substances are going to attract well to water. And the reason they're going to attract so well to water is because they are going to be polar. Remember, water molecules are polar themselves. So they're going to interact with substances that have these poles, these positive or negative charges. And that's going to help something like a sodium ion bind to water quite well. And so why is water such a good solvent? Because when other molecules have charges, it's going to, these partial positive and these partial negative charges are going to form those bonds with those polar molecules, right? And so substances are going to dissolve very easy. Polar substances, very easy. But we also have elements and molecules that do not like water. So a common example is fats or oils or lipids, and these are called hydrophobic substances. And so they are not going to react well with polar substances because they themselves are non-polar. So when you look at lipids, when you look at fats and oils and things like that, these are non-polar substances. So they're not going to get along well, or they're not going to bond well to these more partial negative and these partial positive charges. Within our bodies, we're going to have many different types of mixtures, or a combination of elements or compounds that are blended together but not bound by chemical bonds. And so we have what's called solutions, colloids, and suspensions, and these different mixtures have different properties. A solution contains small solutes in a solvent, and because of this, it's a homogeneous mixture where you're not going to be able to tell the particles apart, and that is a little bit different than a colloid, which has a greater sized solutes, and suspensions which have even greater or bigger solutes within that mixture. And so solutions again are homogeneous, while colloids and suspension are heterogeneous. You're going to see no scattering of light in a solution, so basically a colorless liquid, while in colloids and suspensions you're going to have those particles are going to be so big within the solvent that's going to scatter light a little bit. And so for a solution on a colloid, also what you're going to see is if you took that mixture and you just settled it, those particles are going to be basically dispersed within that solvent, while suspension, what you would see is as soon as you settled it, those solutes would come down to the bottom of that mixture. So there are different ways that we can measure the concentration of solute per a mixture. Commonly we use moles, and so that is called molarity. And so if you're trying to determine how much solute is within a mixture per liter, we use molarity, so the number of moles per solute per liter. We also have what's called equivalence, and so when solutes are ions, remember, meaning that they have either gained or lost electrons, giving them a charge, the amount of ions is then going to determine the charge within that mixture. And then we also have what's called mass per volume, which basically is just the mass of a solute found in a given amount of volume of solution. In chemistry, we talk about molecules that are either inorganic or organic. And so organic molecules are going to contain carbon, while inorganic molecules are not going to contain carbon. Now, most of the cells are going to be comprised of mostly organic materials, but there are also inorganic materials in our bodies as well. And so acids, bases, and salts, when they are put into water, they are going to disassociate. And so, acids, bases, and salts when they're dissolved into water, they are separated into ions. So this acid here, acids are known as proton donators. So when this acid is dumped into the water, that hydrogen proton is going to be separated from the chloride here, and those water molecules with the partial positive and negative charges are going to surround these ions. So this acid is going to disassociate once into water. The same thing for bases. These bases are then proton acceptors, but the same thing. When they're dropped into water, this bond is going to be broken apart, and these water molecules are going to surround these ions. And the same thing goes for salts as well. A mixture, it's going to have a certain level of acidity, otherwise known as pH. And that basically determines how acidic or how basic a solution is. The more acids, again, proton donators, you have within that solution, the lower the pH is going to be. And so for proper homeostasis, acid-base balance is maintained at 7.4 pH. This is the zone that the body likes to hang out in. What happens is when you introduce acids or bases, you can have differences in chemical reactions that are going to occur. If you throw more acids or bases in a solution, you're basically giving more materials for more reactions to occur. But our body likes to hang out, again, at homeostasis, this resting balance. And so it's going to want to maintain an environment of 7.4 at all times. And this is a very strict zone. It's typically not going to go below 7.35 and typically not going to go above 7.45. And if there is a deviation in pH, the body is going to find ways to buffer these bases or these acids. And so buffers are used to either convert strong acids into weak acids or strong bases into weak bases. That is going to conclude part 1 of our chemistry section for human physiology. In part 2, we're going to discuss organic molecules and how these carbon-based structures are going to play a role in our cells and our physiology.